So you want to get better at poker, but you're not sure where to start. You tried watching a live stream, but all the live stream players were fish. You tried watching a poker vlog, but the vlogger was a bigger fish than the live stream player. You tried a solver, but the solver taught you how to play against Doug Polk, and none of the players in your game can even spell Doug Polk, so where do you start? If you feel like you may be wasting your time every time you study poker, I understand. I felt the same way. So today, I'm gonna give you 4 actionable tips that actually help level up your win rate right away. And to walk us through these 4 tips, we're bringing in the co-founder of Hungry Horse Poker, who loves being on video so much, and the best poker player I know, Gethen Jacobs. Gethen, let's jump right in with tip number 1. Where do we start?
Tip number 1, know your opponent's range. What is their range now? Update that after every action. The better and more consistent you are at that, the better your decision making is going to be, particularly on later streets where a lot of people get flustered, confused, and make big, expensive, bad plays.
Okay, so we are playing 2-5 here, and the villain is in the cutoff, and it folds around to the villain. So Gethen, start us off.
I always like to ask our students, what is their range now? And they look at me like I'm crazy. They go, how could I possibly know? And the answer is super, super easy. The answer is 100% of hands. Until they raise, they have any 2. Now, when they raise, now we can start to put them on a range.
Okay, cool. So let's represent this visually here, and we are just going to select all, and this is their range. Does this look accurate to you before there's any action in the hand?
I think that it's fair to say at this point, they can have any 2 cards except for the 2 in my hand.
All right, so now they raise to 20. Let's start narrowing it down.
If we were to use mass data, it would say that fish in the cutoff raise about 18 to 20% of hands, and we could start representing the hands that they do have and maybe the hands that they don't. And if we are really paying attention at the table, maybe they have sizing tells. Maybe when they raise to 3 big blinds, their range looks a little bit different when they raise to 5 big blinds or 6 big blinds. What we're really asking is not, oh, they've raised from the cutoff, but what is their range now?
All right, Gethen, how's this look to you, maybe narrowing down their range when they open in the cutoff here?
I think this is a pretty good starting point for your sort of average, maybe slightly more passive recreational player. Now, it's not going to be precise. Is this player sometimes raising ace-9 offsuit? Sure, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve on, hey, this guy has any 2 cards. Well, now he doesn't. Now there's somewhere in that 20 to 25% of hands. We're starting to think about their range after every action.
All right, so now what happens in this hand is we are going to 3-bet with pocket 8s. As you know, our MO, isolate recreational players, play pots heads up in position. So we're going to 3-bet to $80, folds back around to the cutoff, and now the cutoff calls. So let's jump back into their range here and let's narrow it down further. They have now opened and called a 3-bet.
So we've made a slightly larger than maybe people are used to 3-bet because recreational players make a few mistakes. They call too much, they 4-bet too little, and they fold too little as well. So in this situation, because this player is just called, we can probably rule out some hands. They probably don't have aces. They probably don't have kings. Those are going to be part of their 4-betting range almost all of the time. But we can also probably rule out some of their very worst hands because even fish who like to play hands are still going to fold some of that opening range to our 3-bet, particularly when we use a 4x sizer.
How does this look to you? About 15% of hands. Continuing here, we cut down the offsuit broadways. We have aces and kings 4-betting. We have ace-king suited and ace-king off, sometimes 4-betting, and queens sometimes 4-betting, but not at a super high frequency from a typical live recreational player. And then folding a lot of the 9x and suited gappers and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty good reflection, particularly because we started this hand super deep. I think there's a lot of recreational players who are afraid to put more money in because they know their tendency is an inability to fold. So if they do 4-bet you with queens, they feel obligated to call a 5-bet. So they protect themselves by just calling, by not betting thinly for value, and they end up with a range that is under 4-betting, calling too much, and easy to exploit post-flop.
We are going to go to a flop. Flop is 10-8-5.
Look at that sweet baby there.
Oh, you got it for me. All right, so there you're going to check it over to us, and our MO in 3-bet pots is choose a size where they raise off their strong shit and call with their weak shit. Usually gonna be smaller in a 3-bet pot than a single raise pot because the absolute size of the pot is bigger. So we're going to go $60 here, and now they call. Let's jump back into the range and narrow it down once again.
So when we bet $60 into 160, 170, well, they're probably not calling us with complete air, right? They're probably calling us, and this is where I want to think about buckets. They're gonna call with top pair. They're They're going to call with pocket pairs. They're going to call with second pair. They're going to call with flush draws. They're going to call with straight draws. They might call with some of their best ace-x, right? We can start to remove some of the hands that completely whiff this flop, that just aren't going to call even a small bet. Because on the flop, we always ask the question, what's the biggest size they call with their weak stuff and raise their strong stuff? We are able to start removing hands like pocket eights to a high frequency, pocket tens, pocket fives, maybe even hands like ace 10, hands like pocket jacks, hands like pocket queens, maybe a few of their combo draws, hands like queen jack of hearts, maybe hands like 7-6 of hearts that are likely going to be raised right now. So we're looking at a range that is capped, that has a lot of top pair, has some of their best ace-x, a lot of flush draws, straight draws, pocket pairs, middle pair, pretty wide, but it is also capped because we've removed a lot of the very strong stuff, the 10-8, the hands like pocket tens, hands like pocket eights, hands like pocket fives.
Okay, so for tip number 1, ranging your opponent, we found it's much more helpful to just start subtracting hands from your range. And you see, we took this hand all the way from pre-flop before the action even started to after they opened, after we 3-bet, after we c-bet the flop. And as you go through the hand, you can just start eliminating more and more hands from your opponent's range with each action. If you guys are enjoying Gethen forced to be on camera, please hit that subscribe button, hit the thumbs up, and we will get him back very soon. Thank you guys. Have a gentle day. All right, Gethen, as we move on to the turn here in this hand, can you give us tip number 2?
Tip number 2 is talk it out, right? Practice speaking your thought process, because if you're not able to articulate it in a minute, are you really able to think it in 10, 15 seconds? Speaking it forces you to have organization. It forces you to assess whether what you're actually saying is helpful. Because if you're talking about range advantage or nut advantage and you're playing against a player who can't spell either of those things, that might not be the most important piece of information at that time versus that player.
So we c-bet on the flop, they call, we're going to a turn, which is the innocuous 2 of spades. Now they check to us. Gethen, walk us through your thought process here on this turn.
Well, I would say we have a can play for stacks hand versus a recreational player at about an SPR of what, about 4.4, something like that, 4.5 on this board, which is pretty wet and dynamic. We think we're probably facing a range that looks something like top pair, pocket pairs, middle pair, flush draws, straight draws, and some of their best ace-x. Now I want to ask myself, what portion of that range do I want to target with my pocket eights? And I think because I have a hand that can play for stacks, I want to be building a big pot. So I think the portion of range that I want to target is going to be those inelastic top pairs. It's going to be hands like queens and jacks that maybe didn't 4-bet pre-flop and that just called our c-bet, and their best flush draws and straight draws. I'm not that interested in trying to squeeze out a small amount of extra money against ace queen, ace king, no draw. What's the largest size that portion of range that I'm targeting will call here, that will set me up with the best kind of SPR that I can, where I might be able to play for all the money.
And one of the questions I like to ask on this turn is, Gethen, if I pulled out my handy dandy AK-47 and pointed it to your head, and you were bluffing here on this turn, and you had to get a hand like Jack 10 or Queen 10 suited to fold, what size would you bet on this turn? You have to get Queen 10 suited to fold, and by the way, for every $50 you go too big, you get one finger chopped off, so you do have to be efficient. So what size might you go on this turn to guarantee that fold from Jack 10 suited?
I think on a board like this, where pre-flop, they love to put us on ace king. Well, this board didn't hit ace king. A lot of players like to play Fifth Street chicken. They're gonna call bigger bets than we often think. I think the difference between me and Mark so often is I tend to use slightly smaller sizes. He tends to use slightly bigger sizes. Practicing our calibration. If I had a gun to my head here, to make something like Jack 10 fold, I'm thinking at least 350. I'm thinking probably 350 to 400 if I want to make sure that I don't end up with a bullet in my head.
Now you can distance the forest from the trees, and because you go 350 to 400 to get Jack 10 to fold on this turn, so that means I feel pretty confident that Jack 10 would call here on this turn if we go 275 or 300.
Exactly, and now I can ask myself, well, maybe I can also capture some value from hands like pocket nines, maybe 8x, right? Maybe I can find a size that is close to that threshold for a hand like Jack 10, but also captures value from some sticky, unbelieving hands like 8-9, pocket nines, stuff like that. So maybe I would settle on a number somewhere between, say, 250 and 300.
If we are in a single raise pot, I would absolutely be overbetting this turn because players are much more sensitive to the absolute size of the bet than they are to the relative size of the pot. So what matters a lot more, we're in a 3-bet pot and the bet's gonna be 275 or something like that, which is a big bet for a 2-5 game, then it matters that if we were in a single raise pot and we just 2x pot the turn and the 2x pot size bet was $100, right? Big bet is all relative, right?
Big is just a concept. What that actually is going to be dependent on the player, the board, our image, so many other factors that we want to be thinking to help us with our calibration in game. And maybe to add one more piece of nuance, when we have pocket eights, well, they have more 10x. We are able to target a portion of their range that is likely to call slightly bigger bets, and we are super deep. If we're trying to set up a potential SPR on the river where we can play for all the money, this might be a situation where if I have specifically pocket eights, I'm looking to push the sizes a little bit more because I think good flush draws are still inelastic. I think 10x is pretty inelastic.
All right, Gethen, I'm gonna throw a curveball at you here. Let's say we're in this same spot, right? We're in the same hand, but we actually have Queen Jack of diamonds here on the turn. Now, can you walk us through your thought process when we have a bluff here on the turn instead of having a value hand?
And I think the beauty of having a solid, repeatable thought process is just because we switch from having pocket eights to having queen high doesn't mean everything needs to change. We don't need to suddenly be reinventing the wheel. We can still ask ourselves a lot of the same questions. Their range remains the same. What we're targeting might still remain the same. Instead, what I would add in here when I'm bluffing is, what is the largest size where they still call with that weak stuff? I want to make sure I get them to the river with a wide range, because at 300 big blinds, I'm not sure this player is putting all the money in with ace 10. So if I can get them to put in a bet on the flop, a bet on the turn, and then fold in a big pot on the river, well, that's just the best bluff that I can find, right? That is the bluff that is printing, because I have had them put in a $60 bet on the flop, $250 on the turn, and because the SPR here is deep, because we started this hand almost 300 big blinds effective, I'm still going to have that big, chunky, scary overbet left on the river.
And one more thing I want to add on this turn, just to kind of elaborate on your points here. We want a hand like Jack 10 or Queen 10 to call on this turn, right? Because we don't think those hands are going to play for all the money on the river, so practice that delayed gratification. Our value and our bluffs kind of want to accomplish the same goal here on the turn, to get hands like Jack 10 and Queen 10 to call on the turn, to get their straight draws to call, to get their flush draws to call. And then when we have value on the river, well, we just take the action that gets those hands to call again. And when we have a bluff on the river, like Queen Jack here, we just take whatever action to try to get those hands to fold. Most players probably are not going to hang on with a hand like Jack 10 suited for 3 streets at 300 plus big blinds here. And if you're against a player who's like, wow, this player is so sticky, I don't think they're ever folding Jack 10 on the river, well, you know exactly what to do when you have pocket eights, right?
One of those two things has to be true, right? They're either not folding 10x or they are folding 10x. And we have exploits versus both. If we don't ask the questions, if we don't practice our thought process, if we don't articulate it out loud, it is so easy not to see that contradiction.
Okay, so tip number 2 has been saying your thought process out loud. We walked through that. Gethen, give us tip number 3.
Tip number 3, add time pressure. Too often, I'm guilty of this. Most of my study was slow. I'd dive into solvers. I'd spend 45 minutes reviewing a hand. Now, if you go do that at the casino, you get punched in the face. You're gonna have 5 seconds, 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds on early streets. And if you're really pushing it, 30 seconds on the river. When you add time pressure, you find out what actually matters. Because if you have 5 minutes, you can think of everything. When you have 5 seconds, you have to prioritize.
All right, so the innocuous 3 of diamonds on the river. We are gonna put Gethen on the clock here. Gethen, we're putting you on the spot. You've got 30 seconds to walk us through your thoughts and your final action on this river. Ready, set, go.
Opponent's range, 10x, pocket jacks, pocket queens, missed draws, and probably some pocket pairs. What portion of that am I targeting? 10x, queens and jacks. What would I do with the inverse? If I was trying to make ace 10 fold, what size would I pick? I think I'd be jamming here. I think we're deep enough to make a hand like that fold. So I'm gonna use a smaller size, somewhere around pot.
All right, so we are gonna go somewhere just a little under pot here on this river, say $600, and we are going to try to get the call with pocket eights. All right, so I think a mistake a lot of people make is they're just like, well, we practiced this hand, we did it, let's jump to the next hand. And I think you can reuse this hand. All you have to do here, change the river and walk through that thought process again. So now on this river, instead of a blank, we are going to put an ace on this river, and we're gonna put Gethen on the spot again. Gethen, you've got 30 seconds now on the ace of diamonds river. Ready, set, go.
What is their range? Well, it's still 10x jacks, queens, but now it's also ace-x of hearts and obviously some missed flush draws. What portion of that am I targeting with my eights? Well, I'd have to use a pretty small size, I think, to target 10x. So I think I might be targeting two pairs like ace 10, ace 5, ace deuce of hearts, as well as ace-x of hearts. What would I bet to make those fold? Probably couldn't. Might be jamming here with pocket eights.
So we are going to jam with pocket eights. All right, Gethen, now let's say the river is still an ace, but now we have queen jack of diamonds that gets here, so we have a busted gut shot that gets here to the river. Walk us through your thought process. 30 seconds, once again, on the clock. Ready, set, go.
What is their range? Well, it's still some two pairs, which I would call brick walls, some 10x, some missed draws, and also some ace-x of hearts. What portion of that range am I targeting? Well, I think I can obviously make hearts fold. I think I can make 10x fold. What would I bet to get called by 10x on an ace river? Probably pretty small, somewhere around maybe 200, 250. What would be my bluff size? A little bit more, maybe 300, 350 here.
So you are trying to get hands like jack 10, queen 10, king 10 to fold on this river. So when you bet the 300 to 350 here, not only do you get the king 10, queen 10, jack 10 to fold, which has been downgraded on this river, but you also get those king high flush draws to fold, or maybe the 5x of hearts flush draws to fold that you lose to as well. So we are going to go 350 on this river with the queen jack of diamonds. As you can see on these rivers, it's not like we're just always going huge with our bluffs, or we're just always going huge with our value. It always depends upon what is their range and what are we trying to accomplish. Gethen was able to walk you through very clearly how he's able to do that in 30 seconds on this river. And we change the river, we can change our cards. We can even change things like, hey, now we're playing against a reg, now we're playing against a tilted whale, etc. You can take one hand and practice it in 50 different ways. All right, Gethen, we've gone through the first 3 tips. Can you give us tip number 4?
Tip number 4, fixing our common mistakes.
And what are those common mistakes that you see time and time again, and how do you fix them?
Common mistake number 1, action before thoughts. Too many people pick the action and then have thoughts about why to do it. That means they disregard information that maybe is counter to it, and they don't have a repeatable thought process that leads them to the best play. They start with a play and hope that the thoughts justify it afterwards. Common mistake number 2, not asking the right questions in hands.
So what would be some of the right questions to ask?
Well, the best thought process would be one question, which is, what is the highest EV play here? Let's face it, that's not always the easiest one to be able to answer right away. So we have to ask ourselves some questions like, what is their range? What portion of that range are we targeting? What types of mistakes is this opponent making? And how do I exploit those mistakes most effectively?
And notice that Gethen said nothing there about range advantage, nut advantage, minimum defense frequency, or any other fancy poker words, jargon. You don't need to use that stuff when you are playing live against Big Jeremy in seat 8.
Clear, easy to follow strategies that are built on the mistakes our opponent is making. We don't get to set what a good play is. Their bad plays allow us to take advantage of those by making exploits. Their strategy informs our strategy. Common mistake number 3, forgetting to ask the inverse question on the river. If I have a value hand, what size would I bet with a bluff? And if I have a bluff, what size would I be picking here with my value?
And why is that so important?
Too often we end up not catching our lack of coherence, right? We say, hey, I don't want him to fold, so I'm gonna bet half pot. And then we get to that same spot and we have a bluff and we go, he's not gonna fold. I have 2x pot back, but I'm just gonna give up. Something is broken there. If we force ourselves to ask, what size would I actually bet here to make them fold when I have a value hand, we are going to get much closer to finding that sweet spot when it comes to picking a value size that actually captures the max EV. Common mistake number 4, not bucketing our opponent's range. When you have 30 seconds, you don't have time to say, well, they have ace 10, king 10, well, they could have 9-7 of hearts. You need to use big buckets, top pair, middle pair, flush draws, straight draws, because if you get too granular too quickly, you're gonna run out of time, you're gonna get flustered, and you're gonna miss the forest through the trees.
All right, guys, hopefully these 4 tips actually lead to making your studying time useful and level up your win rate. Thank you, Gethen, for being here. We will see you guys soon. Have a gentle day.